Hi all. Today I'll be discussing the labor theory of value as the theme of this week. Firstly, what I will do is just give a definition of what the labor theory of value is, and then from there I'll just give certain explanations and of how we should understand the labor theory of value from the works of David Ricardo, Karl Marx, and Adam Smith. Right. So the definition of the labor theory of value is that it is a theory of value holding that the quantity of labor in a product regulates its value, and utilized by Marx to claim for labor the sole right full claim to production. So what is, in actual fact, the labor theory of value? The labor theory of value was an early attempt by economists to explain why goods were exchanged for certain relative prices on the market. It suggested that the value of a commodity was determined by and could be measured objectively by the average number of labor hours necessary to produce it, right? So in the labor theory of value, the amount of labor that goes into producing an economic good is the source of that good's value. The best known advocates of the labor theory of value were, of course, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx. For instance, Adam Smith flirted with a labor theory of value in his classical Defense of Capitalism in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And later, David Ricardo systematized it in his Principles of Political Economy in 1817. A text studied by generations of free market economists, right? So, in understanding the labor theory of value and how we should actually understand it, is that according to the labor theory of value, developed, of course, by David Ricardo, um, the value of a thing depends on the amount of labor required to produce it. Thus, in the opinion of Adam Smith, if one thing requires twice as much labor to produce as another thing, it should be twice as valuable, right? So the labor theory was employed by classical economists to explain the determination of relative prices on the basis of quantities of labor, immediate and accumulated, embodied in goods. By immediate labor is meant the current effort of a worker, and by accumulated labor is meant the services of capital, which represents the past input of labor. The labor theory of value suggested that two commodities will trade for the same price if they embody the same amount of labor time, or else they will exchange at a ratio fixed by the relative differences in two labor times. For instance, if it takes 20 hours to hunt a deer and 10 hours to trap a beaver, then the exchange ratio would be 2 beavers for 1 deer, right? So the labor theory of value was, of course, first conceived by ancient Greek and medieval philosophers, and then later, in developing their labor theory of value, both Adam Smith in The World of Nations and Ricardo began by imagining a hypothetical, rude and early state of humanity consisting of simple commodity production, right? This was not meant to be an accurate or historical reality. It was thought it was a thought experiment to derive the more developed version of the theory. In this early state, there are only self-producers in the economy who all own their own materials, equipment, and tools needed to produce. So there are no class distinctions between capitalist, labor, and landlord, meaning that the concept of capital was, as we know it, has not yet come to play yet. They took the simplified example of two commodity world consisting of beaver and deer. If it is more profitable to produce deer than beaver, then there will be a migration of people into a deer production and out of beaver production, right? So the supply of deer will increase in kind, causing the incomes in deer production to drop, with a simultaneous rise in beaver incomes as a fewer choose that employment. It is important to understand that the incomes of the self-producers are regulated by the quantity of labor embodied in production, often expressed as labor time. So Smith wrote that labor was the original exchange of money for all commodities, and therefore the more labor employed in production, the greater the value of that item in exchange with other items on a relative basis, right? So while Smith described the concept and underlying principle of the labor theory of value, Ricardo was interested in how those relative prices between commodities were governed. Take again the example of the 10 labor hours to produce one deer, and then one beaver would exchange for 2 deer, both equal to 20 units of labor time, you know. So the cost of production not only involves the direct cost of going out and hunting, but also the indirect cost in the production of necessary implements. For instance, the trap to catch the beaver, or the bow and arrow to hunt the deer. The total quantity of labor time is vertically integrated, like including both direct and indirect labor time, right? So if it requires 12 hours to make a beaver trap and 8 hours to catch the beaver, that equals to 20 total hours of labor time, right? So this is how we can then see and get the explanation of how to understand the whole concept of the labor theory of value, of course, from the works of David Ricardo and Adam Smith and all that, you know. So the same analogy can be used on the pair of shoes, for example. You know, if a pair of shoes usually takes twice as long to produce a pair of pants, for example, then shoes are twice as valuable as pants. In the long run, the competitive price of shoes will be twice the price of pants, regardless of the value of the physical inputs, right? So let me explain that again. Like I said, the same analogy with beaver and deer can be used in the pair of shoes. If a pair of shoes usually takes twice as long to produce as a pair of pants, for example, then shoes are twice as valuable as pants. Meaning, in the long run, the competitive price of shoes will be twice of the price of pants, regardless of the value of the physical inputs, right? So now I just want to give an explanation of the ideas of Karl Marx on the labor theory of value, right? So the labor theory of value is a major pillar of traditional Marxian economists, which is evident in Marx's masterpiece Capital in 1867. So the labor theory of value was not unique to Marxism, but Marx did attempt, however, to turn the theory against the champions of capitalism, pushing the theory in a direction that most classical economics hesitated to follow. Marx argued that the theory could explain the value of all commodities, including the commodity that workers sell to capitalists for a wage. Marx called this commodity labor power, right? So labor power is the worker's capacity to produce goods and services. Marx, using principles of classical economics, explained that the value of labor power must depend on the number of labor hours it takes society on an average to feed, clothe, and shelter a worker so that he or she has the capacity to work. So, in other words, the long run wage workers receive will depend on the number of labor hours it takes to produce a person who fits for work. Suppose it takes 5 hours of labor are needed to feed, clothe, and protect a worker each day, so that the worker is fit for work the following morning. If one labor hour equaled 1 rand, the correct wage will be 5 rands per day. So that was Marx's view on the labor theory of value. But then Marx then asked an apparently devastating question, you know. If all goods and services in a capitalist society tend to be sold at prices and wages that reflect their true value measured by labor hours, how can it be that capitalists enjoy profits, even if only in the short run? How do capitalists manage to squeeze out a residual between total revenue and total costs? Capitalists, Marx answered, must enjoy a privileged and powerful position as owners of the means of production, and therefore able to ruthlessly exploit workers. Although the capitalist pays workers the correct wage, somehow Marx was terribly vague here, because the capitalist makes workers work more hours than are needed to create the workers' labor power. If the capitalist pays each worker 5 rands per day, he can require workers to work, say, 12 hours per day. In a not uncommon work day during Marx's time. So hence, if 1 labor hour equals 1 rand, workers produce 12 rands of worth of products for capitalists, but are paid only 5. The bottom line here is that capitalists extract surplus value from the workers and enjoy monetary profits, right? So although Marx tried to use the labor theory of value against capitalism by stretching it out to its limits, he unintentionally demonstrated the weakness of the theory's logic and underlying assumptions. Marx was correct when he claimed that classical economics failed to adequately explain capitalist profits, but Marx failed as well. By the late 19th century, the economics profession rejected the theory of value. Mainstream economics now believe that capitalists do not earn profits by exploiting workers. Instead, they believe entrepreneurial capitalists earn profits by foregoing current consumption, by taking risk, and by organizing production. In terms of the David Ricardo's views on the labor theory of value, is that he first started his labor theory of value in print in the first edition of his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. This theory was, in his opinion, a doctrine of the utmost importance in political economy. For from no source do so many errors and so much difference of opinion in that science proceed as from the vague ideas which are attached to the word value. Since then, the theory attracted much attention and generated lively controversies, mainly for 3 reasons. First, this theory was openly opposing what Adam Smith had stated in his inquiry into the nature of causes and wealth of nations, especially because Ricardo was maintaining that Smith's assertion that all prices vary with a change in wages, and the same direction was erroneous. Second, some commentators like Torrance in particular stressed the fact that Ricardo's developments on the subject were flawed. Thirdly, subsequent to publications of Karl Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, the first and third volumes of Das Kapital, Ricardo's theory of value was typically read through a Marxian lens. This, however, conferred a special theoretical and political bias to the debates until the edition by Piero Sfara, with the collaboration of Maurice Herbert Daub of the works and correspondence of David Ricardo from 1951 onwards. So it was argued that prices would be proportional to the quantities of embodied labor in goods. It was recognized, for example, by Ricardo that the theory broke down when production of different goods required different time periods or capital to labor ratios differed among them. If 2 goods had identical labor inputs but one was produced with more capital, then the producer of capital-intensive good would need to compensate it for the large volume of capital out of the market price of the commodity. So if the prices were the same, his rate of profit must be lower. If he is to earn an equal rate of profit, his price must be higher. Embodied labor then fails to explain prices. A simple argument holds for different periods of production if rates of profit are to be equalized. So, having said that, based on what David Ricardo was saying, is that the labor theory of value is important in as much as it draws attention to the grievances of labor and to the exploitation which they suffer at the same hands of the capitalists. So, for the Marx theory of labor was more just a theory of relative prices and was in effect the key to understanding capitalism, whereas in his system only laborer can create value, but it is unable to keep to itself all the value created. For the capitalist is able to extract a surplus value or economic profit, which then reinvested in machinery, which leads to a growth of capitalist economic system and its eventual collapse. Marx did, however, modify the labor theory by introducing the qualifications that different grades of labor should be reduced to simple labor, specifically unit of standard efficiency, and that the labor should be socially necessary one labor. Socially necessary labor is that's required by the average technology of that time, to prevent labor operating with backward technology being credited with the creation of unjustified value, which makes a product for which there is a demand. Without demand, labor is not treated as socially necessary, and so no value can be created. This latter qualification substantially weakens the claim of the labor theory that it takes that then can explain prices. So, in understanding, of course, from David Ricardo's work and everything that I just mentioned, is that the key lessons to take from all this, in this difficulty of explaining the labor theory of value, is that it states that the value of economic goods derives from the amount of labor necessary to produce it, right? So, in the labor theory of value, relative prices between goods are explained by and expected to tend toward a natural price, which reflects the relative amount of labor that goes into producing them, right? It was also important that in terms of economics, the labor theory of value became dominant over the subjective theory of value during